Hi, Professor Monroe here, and in this video we're going to focus on applying rule utilitarianism to solve an ethical decision. So, as with all of our theories, we're going to be looking at Carina's dilemma from the chapter on consequentialist ethical theories. If you haven't made yourself familiar with that case study by now, you'll want to review it before we apply it. Apply this theory, otherwise it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. So if you need to stop for a moment and refresh yourself or update your knowledge about that case, please do so, and then continue the video. Applying rule utilitarianism ideally ought to be rather easy. The idea of the theory, after all, is that we find the right kinds of rules that we need for a happy society, and then once those rules are in place, we just follow them. So it should be, at least in principle, possible for us to just take the rules that we've got, apply those to our problems, and get our answer. But we want to add a critical element here that goes beyond that simple kind of reasoning. After all, we want to make sure that the rules we're following are the right ones, as opposed to just blindly following rules that happen to exist. We need to be able to determine, that is, whether or not rules actually do produce more happiness than unhappiness. So for that reason, as we go through this process of applying the theory to a real-life problem, you'll add in this step of trying to figure out the net utility of the rules in addition to solving the problem. So it makes it a little bit more complicated, but at the end of the day, makes for a better ethical decision. So in applying rule utilitarianism, you'll notice that this is fundamentally different from act utilitarianism. We're not starting by talking about what the fundamental problem is. We start by listing rules relevant to the situation at hand. So not just this situation, but other situations as well. Think of this more as a question of what should someone in Carina's position do about this problem, rather than what should Carina do about this problem. The second step is to determine the net utility for each rule that you come up with, if it were to be followed generally. So what we're doing here is thinking about rules that might become policies for solving situations like the one that Carina's in. Which of these rules that we consider would be the better policy or the best way to go as far as solving this problem? So we'll determine the net utility of rules rather than of specific options for solving the problem. The third step is to choose the rule with the highest net utility. So which of these proposed policies is the one that's going to make more people happy than unhappy? And then lastly, we'd apply that rule to the ethical problem at hand. And here's where the application becomes situational. Once we know what the rule is that would make the most people happy rather than unhappy, that's the rule that we follow in solving Carina's problem. So, in step one, we should list the moral rules relevant to situations such as this. So what rules might we propose to look at problems like Carina's? Well, one rule that we might propose we'll call Rule 1. And Rule 1 here says, hypothetically, employees should remain loyal no matter what illegal or unethical things the employers do. All right, now notice that this isn't an option for how to solve the problem. What we're talking about is a kind of policy that we might follow, or a general rule to help us guide our actions. So the first one, R1. The second one, R2, says employees should mind their own business, ignoring all illegal and unethical actions around them unless directly impacted by those actions, which is to say, mind your own beeswax unless the problem is your problem. Rule number 3, we propose, perhaps, that employees should report to appropriate law enforcement authorities all illegal or unethical activities, no matter how trivial or insignificant. So whenever there's wrongdoing, employees ought to report their companies to outside enforcement agencies. Rule number 4 we might propose would be that employees should try to resolve ethical and legal problems within the company first, going to outside authorities or media only as a last resort and only for serious transgressions. So these are rules that we've come up with that might be relevant to a situation like Carina's. And now what we shall do is try to figure out the net utility of each of these rules if they were to be followed as a kind of general policy or principle. Now, this is a little bit trickier than what we've done before with act utilitarianism, where we're looking at the specific happiness or unhappiness that an individual option would cause. It's a little bit more difficult to forecast with any real precision what the happiness or unhappiness or net utility in that sense of a rule would be sort of globally. Right? If everyone followed it, if everyone were impacted, how we add up exactly that number of happiness and unhappiness, that seems like too tall an order. So here, when we weigh the net utility of a general rule like this, what we're thinking of is in sort of terms of broad strokes. What are the likely logical ramifications of a rule like this? And if those likely logical ramifications of a rule would be that they'd tend to promote happiness, then we'd say that rule is justified. And if the likely logical ramifications of that rule are that they promote unhappiness, then we'd say that rule is unjustified. But again, here we're doing a little bit of forecasting, trying to figure out the likely impact of these rules, but it's going to be a little more nebulous even than our ACT utilitarianism. We're kind of ballparking here. But we can make some pretty informed forecasts. So with Rule 1, we're going to paraphrase that to remain loyal to the company no matter what illegal or unethical things are going on. How would that likely yield in terms of outcomes? Well, is it likely to be more beneficial than harmful to have a policy that says employees should be loyal no matter what a company is doing? If you think about it, if it were the case that everyone ought to keep quiet whenever their company is doing something and remain loyal to that company, doesn't it seem likely that companies would they be more or less likely to continue to do sort of dirty, underhanded things? It seems to be that they'd be more likely to do the wrong thing than the right thing. If they never had any fear of reprisal or anyone informing on them, chances are that's going to be a more harmful rule than beneficial in the long run. If it were true that employees should just keep quiet about what their companies are doing, no matter how bad. Rule number 2, employees should mind their own business unless directly affected. Well, that doesn't seem quite as unsettling, perhaps, as employees doing nothing whenever a company is doing wrong. But notice that the fact that it has to do with employees being directly affected narrows the scope of times that employees might report on wrongdoing. Sometimes that's okay, but the kinds of things that might be falling through the cracks if they didn't affect an employee directly leaves a wide range of kinds of things that we'd like, maybe kinds of wrongdoing that we'd like reported more generally. So typically, over time, we might forecast that this rule also leads to more harm than good, and in the long run would be less likely to make people happy than not. Rule number 3, employees should report all transgressions no matter how trivial. So no matter what's going on in the company, whether it's a minor thing like stealing staplers or accepting gifts from a purveyor, something like that, or whether it's chemical dumping like in Karina's case, no matter the magnitude of what's going on, this rule would say that employees should report everything to outside agencies no matter what, no matter how trivial or small. If we think about the likely ramifications of this rule, in terms of happiness and unhappiness, this seems a little bit like overkill. It's a rule that becomes excessively burdensome. Over time, the number of reports as they increase for the smallest kinds of things, you see more people spending more time chasing down small little hassles that could probably better be handled internally, and it would drain law enforcement resources, it would drain media resources, and so on. So over time, probably, even though you're more likely to catch more wrongdoing, it promotes more unhappiness because of wasted time and lack of bad use of resources than letting those few more transgressions go. Rule number 4, employees should try to resolve issues internally first and then report to outside law enforcement or media sources. The companies here would still be held accountable. All right, so you have this thing of capturing problems. But you give them the opportunity to self-correct. So it isn't that the employees should run right off and tell everyone what's going on at the first sign of trouble. Rather, when something big and important happens, what an employee ought to do, as the principal is saying, is try to get the company to resolve it first, and then, if necessary, go to outside sources. That doesn't seem excessively burdensome. And it seems like it's relatively fair to all the parties involved. The company gets the opportunity to do the right thing, but the employees have the opportunity and the outlet for reporting wrongdoing, and it doesn't unfairly burden law enforcement or media outlets. So it looks like rule number 4 has a higher net utility than the other 3. Our next step is to choose the rule with the highest net utility, and as we sort of saw in the last step, that looks like rule number 4, which says employees should try to resolve ethical and legal problems within the company first, going to outside authorities or the media only as a last resort, and only for the most serious transgressions. Why? Because this seems to balance the interests of all the parties involved, and over time would probably make more of the folks involved happy rather than unhappy, and lead to a more generally happy and stable society. So our last step in the process is to now localize this to Karina's problem. We're looking at Karina's case specifically. What should she do about the illegal dumping in her company? And if we apply this rule to that particular problem, Karina should alert the management of her knowledge of the problem, so they know that she knows, and deliver the ultimatum. Then, if the company doesn't fix the issue, Karina should blow the whistle to her reporter uncle. So her action then conforms to the rule that we've shown to have the highest net utility.